Hello, my name is Carol Faulkner, and I'm a professor of history in the Maxwell School at Syracuse University. And this lecture is part of the USA at 250 series. And the topic today will be the woman citizen question mark. I'm going to start with some reminders. First of all, the Declaration of Independence, whose 250th year we are celebrating in 2026, which has the famous lines, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." In 1848, women's rights activists at the Seneca Falls Convention wrote their own declaration of sentiments, and they modified the Declaration of Independence to say, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal." And I also have another quote on this slide from Lucretia Mott, one of the women's rights activists at the Seneca Falls Convention. And I want to take her statement as a starting point for my lecture. Lucretia Mott wrote, "She is deprived," she meaning woman, "is deprived of almost every right in civil society and is a cipher in the nation, except in the right of presenting a petition." So what did Mott mean by stating that woman is a cipher in the nation? For Mott, it likely meant that women were invisible or absent, but it can also mean a puzzle. As we will see today, the petition became a key tool in women's struggle for equality, which is also in Mott's quote, and so we'll talk about that as well. Today, I will show how women's status as citizens evolved over time through two major pushes for women's equality: the suffrage movement and the fight for the Equal Rights Amendment, or the ERA. I will argue that women's equality remains a difficult puzzle to solve, in part because Americans, including American women, remain divided over what equality means for women and how to achieve it. And one tension that I'll highlight, and it will be a repeated theme throughout my talk today, is that women's potential to be mothers has shaped their relationship to citizenship. And conversely, we also see a fear of gender revolution. Would equality mean that women will become like men? Would they abandon their role as mothers? Would they be forced to abandon their role as mothers? Would they lose protections they already have under the law? My lecture will be divided into three main sections. So first we'll talk about women's legal and political status in the new nation, then women's struggle for the right to vote, also known as the suffrage movement or the movement for the enfranchisement of women, and then finally, the Equal Rights Amendment and its opponents. As we discuss these topics, I will emphasize important differences among women, especially along racial, class, and ideological lines, and how these have shaped the struggle for equal citizenship. In other words, women did not agree on strategy, tactics, or goals based on their different experiences as women. So we'll start, just to give us some common language to talk about, with what are the rights of citizens now? On its website, the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services notes that citizens have the following rights: the right to live in the United States, the right to vote in federal elections, the right to be loyal and support the Constitution, and they have an image of military service next to that one, the right to work in the U.S., the right to run for federal office, the right to apply for a passport, and the right to serve on juries. I thought this was kind of an interesting list because it doesn't actually include the Bill of Rights, the freedom of speech, and other rights like that. I do want to mention what this image is on the slide, which is a passport from the 1850s. And so that's what the passport used to look like in the United States. And it's actually a passport for a African-American man. So what rights and responsibilities did women have in the early years of the United States? Women's legal and political status was largely imported from British common law. The man in the painting is Blackstone, who is a British jurist who is known for writing down all the common law. And you might remember that in the Declaration of Sentiments, married women's status was described as civil death. And so we see two types of legal status for women. They could be a femme sole, which meant that they were unmarried, that they were a single woman. Of course, 90% or more of women married during this time. And then femme covert. And that meant that a woman's political and legal and economic identity was covered by their husband once they were married. They no longer had an independent identity from their husband. The husband and wife were one. So, of course, they could not vote, with one short-lived exception that I will talk about. They could not hold office, serve on juries, or serve in the military unless they disguised themselves as men, which some women did during both the American Revolution and the Civil War. But as Mott noted, women did have their First Amendment rights. And the First Amendment, of course, states, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So it's that right to petition in the First Amendment that became very important to women. At first, American women mostly used the petition process as individuals to seek financial support from Congress, usually as Revolutionary War widows. But it gradually became a collective way for women to assert their political voice on issues like Indian removal, slavery, and other causes. This slide shows a petition against Cherokee removal from 1830. And I especially want to highlight the language in this petition. The women who have signed this petition, as you can see, are from Steubenville, Ohio. And I especially want to call attention to the second paragraph there. It is readily acknowledged that the wise and venerated founders of our country's free institutions have committed the powers of government to those whom nature and reason declare the best fitted to exercise them. In other words, the men are best fitted to exercise them. And your memorialists would sincerely deprecate any presumptuous interference on the part of their own sex with the ordinary political affairs of the country as wholly unbecoming the character of American females. Even in private life, we may not presume to direct the general conduct or control the acts of those who stand in the near and guardian relations of husbands and brothers. Yet all admit that there are times when duty and affection call on us to advise and persuade, as well as to cheer or to console. And if we approach the public representatives of our husbands and brothers only in the humble character of suppliants in the cause of mercy and humanity, may we not hope that even the small voice of female sympathy will be heard. So they are very much limiting or creating a limit on what they're trying to do, right? They say, we're not really trying to interfere in the politics of the nation, but as women, we are more sympathetic, and we want to raise your sympathies to the plight of the Cherokee. And note in the first paragraph, they're especially concerned about the Cherokee because they are fellow Christians. So women in the anti-slavery movement in particular flooded Congress with petitions. So many that Congress passed a gag rule, which lasted from 1836 to 1844, which tabled all anti-slavery petitions and thus stifled one of women's only political rights. And of course, what did women do in response? But they petitioned against the gag rule. And this is a petition from 1836 against the gag rule. And you can see the difference in language from the petition that we just saw. Here are women. Your memorialists consider this resolution a violation of the Constitution of the United States, of the right of the people of the United States to petition, and of the right of their representatives to freedom of speech as members of your honorable body. They further regard it as an assumption of authority at once dangerous and destructive to the fundamental principles of Republican government, to the rights of minorities, to the sovereignty of the people, and to the union of these United States. And they ask them to immediately rescind it, right? So there's none of this language that women are stepping out of their place, that they only want to appeal to the humanity of and the sympathy of the legislatures, just as they would their husbands and brothers. No, they're being very clear that they know their Constitution and they want their legislatures to uphold it. But women's lack of political standing did not mean that they were not valued. In fact, their position as mothers meant they were essential to the young nation. Women's education spread rapidly in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, in part because the new nation agreed that educated women would then educate their sons to be good citizens. The man in the painting here is Benjamin Rush, a signer of the Declaration of Independence and a Philadelphia physician. In 1787, he published his Thoughts upon Female Education. In it, he argued that American women needed a different sort of education than British women, and that American women needed that education because they had a responsibility to raise their children to be good citizens. And you can see this especially in the first two paragraphs, right? In the first paragraph, he says, men are always often called away, and so women take part in the instruction of their children. It becomes us, therefore, to prepare them by a suitable education for the discharge of their most important duty of mothers. And he goes on, the equal share that every citizen has in the liberty and the possible share he may have in the government of our country make it necessary that our ladies should be qualified to a certain degree by a peculiar and suitable education to concur in instructing their sons in the principles of liberty and government. Right? So women have to be able to instruct their sons in liberty and government. And of course, then he further pans to women's motherhood and their behind every great man is a great woman, et cetera, et cetera. So women's education spread rapidly, and you can see a little bit of this on this timeline. At first, beyond basically what we would call grammar school today, there were female seminaries, and the most famous of these was one run by a woman named Emma Willard, and it was known as the Troy Female Seminary, founded in 1814. It's now the Emma Willard School. And that was mostly what we might think of as similar to a high school. But then we started getting higher education as well. So Oberlin College was the first coeducational and racially integrated institution in the country. That was founded in 1833. You see Mount Holyoke College, founded in 1837. And then during the Civil War and afterwards, we see education for women expand. This is in part due to the Morrill Land Grant Act during the Civil War. So we see some land grant institutions like Kansas State and the University of Wisconsin. Syracuse University was also part of this development of greater access to higher education for women, founded in 1870. And of course, we see the Ivy Leagues as latecomers to this, Yale admitting women in 1969 and Columbia in 1983. And so the idea that women needed to be mothers of and for the nation persisted and evolved along with women's higher education. And we also see this in the struggle for women's right to vote. After the demands of the Seneca Falls Convention, and at the Seneca Falls Convention, they demanded access to education, careers, a single moral standard for men and women, rights in marriage, the right to vote, obviously. But after the Seneca Falls Convention, the next major evolution of women's status as citizens took place after the American Civil War, as the nation amended its constitution to account for the end of slavery. And so on this slide, I have the Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And these amendments, importantly, ended the institution of slavery, established the citizenship of Black Americans, and established Black men's right to vote. And I just want to highlight the language of the 15th Amendment. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And so that phrasing will become important, as we will see. But note that it is not a positive statement of the right to vote, just that it will not be denied. As we know, women's rights activists had demanded the right to vote at Seneca Falls. And so why did they view this as an essential goal? In the first years of the country, voting rights were largely restricted to elite, property-owning, generally white men. Very briefly, property-owning women had the right to vote in New Jersey. At the insistence of a Quaker assemblyman in 1790, the Constitution of New Jersey allowed single women and widows owning property to cast ballots. These rights were then taken away by male politicians in 1807. Though fewer than 10,000 women may have been eligible to vote in New Jersey, one newspaper noted that women may have accounted for a quarter of all voters in some places. Scholars disagree about why this period of inclusion of women voters ended. Some say it was partisan. The state revoked women's right to vote because New Jersey's burgeoning Jeffersonian faction believed women favored the Federalists. Others argue that it reflected a larger backlash against the egalitarian values of the Revolution. In any case, New Jersey was unique. In the rest of the young nation, women never lawfully voted. Then, in the 1820s and 1830s, states began revising their constitutions, their state constitutions, to enfranchise all adult white men. As they did so, some of them also disenfranchised Black men, as they did in Pennsylvania in 1838. Robert Purvis, a wealthy free Black man and a leading abolitionist in Pennsylvania, and the man pictured on the slide, protested this disenfranchisement of Pennsylvania Black citizens, leading an appeal of 40,000 citizens, as it was called. He wrote, "We honor Pennsylvania and her noble institutions too much to part with our birthright as her free citizens without a struggle. To all her citizens, the right of suffrage is valuable in proportion as she is free, but surely there are none who can so ill afford to spare it as ourselves. Why should tax-paying colored men, any more than other taxpayers, be deprived of the right of voting for their representatives? It was said in the convention that this government belongs to the whites. Those who established our present government designed it equally for all. It is for you to decide whether it shall be confined to the European complexion in future. Why should you exclude us from a fair participation in the benefits of the Republic?" And so you can see in Robert Purvis's arguments that it was very deliberate, right? That as they enfranchised all adult white men, they reshaped American democracy to be more exclusionary of free Black men. Still, this new democratic expansion made women's exclusion, particularly white women's exclusion, from the vote even more glaring, and to some women, insulting. This is a quote from Elizabeth Cady Stanton's speech to the New York State Legislature in 1854, and you can see her argument here for why women should vote. We are persons, native, freeborn citizens, property holders, taxpayers, yet we are denied our right to the elective franchise. We have every qualification required by the Constitution necessary to the legal voter, but the one of sex. We are moral, virtuous, and intelligent, and in all respects quite equal to the proud white man himself, and yet by your laws we are classed with, and then she listed a whole bunch, but including Black Americans. It is folly to talk of a mother molding the character of her son when all mankind, backed up by law and public sentiment, conspire to destroy her influence. But when women's moral power shall speak through the ballot box, then shall her influence be seen and felt. Right? So she's basically saying the country pays all this homage to women as mothers, right, and praises their status as mothers and all that they do for the nation in the role of mothers. But really that's all lip service if women can't vote and actually influence the nature and thus truly influence their sons. Women resented being classed with children. They resented being classed with African Americans in their exclusion from the vote. And they felt that this was all a denial of their natural rights, as you see in Stanton's speech. So women's motherhood was central to many women's rights activists' arguments for the vote. And women's rights activists wanted to be included in the Reconstruction Amendments. After the Civil War, with abolitionist allies, they formed the American Equal Rights Association to lobby for universal suffrage, that is, voting rights for all adults, regardless of race. As one historian has written, they believed they had a fighting chance. However, activists disagreed over strategy. Many abolitionists and women's rights activists believed the priority had to be the enfranchisement of Black men and advocated for the 15th Amendment. Lucretia Mott was one of these activists. So was Frederick Douglass, who argued that the ballot was an urgent and necessary response to racial violence. His friend Susan B. Anthony focused on the privileges of sex, pointing out that Douglass, quote, would not exchange his sex and color, wronged as he is, with Elizabeth Cady Stanton. But Elizabeth Cady Stanton resorted to racism to make her arguments. She described manhood suffrage as, quote, national suicide and women's destruction by placing, quote, our free institutions in the care and keeping of every type of manhood, in the hands of ignorance and vice, ignoring their own wives and mothers, all the elevating and purifying influence of the most virtuous, humane, and educated half of the American people. And that's some of her less pointed language, as in the same speech she disparaged Irish men, Black men, and Chinese men as not deserving the vote over white women. Stanton and Anthony were certainly angry about the betrayal of their former abolitionist allies, but they also had a racist view of their own superiority and believed that they deserved rights over others. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, a free Black poet and abolitionist from Maryland, was more skeptical of the virtues of white women and the potential effects of their enfranchisement. And you can see her speech here. I do not believe that giving women the ballot is immediately going to cure all the ills of life. I do not believe that white women are dewdrops just exhaled from the skies. I think that, like men, they may be divided into three classes: the good, the bad, and the indifferent. The good would vote according to their convictions and principles, the bad as dictated by prejudice or malice, and the indifferent will vote on the strongest side of the question with the winning party. After the passage of the 15th Amendment, Stanton proposed a 16th Amendment, which was, of course, never passed. But I'm just going to read the language to you because it's very interesting compared to the other language we've seen. Her version read, "The right of suffrage in the United States shall be based on citizenship and shall be regulated by Congress, and all citizens of the United States, whether native or naturalized, shall enjoy the right equally without any distinction or discrimination whatever founded on sex. And so we see the passage of the 15th Amendment in 1870 pushed the evolution of the women's movement from a multi-issue movement, all of the things covered in the Seneca Falls Declaration of Sentiments, to a single-issue movement, which was the vote. And it also divided the women's movement for decades. Women formed two organizations, the National Women's Suffrage Association and the American Women's Suffrage Association, and the two organizations did not reunite until 1890 in the final push for women's right to vote. And I just want to go back to this slide because Reconstruction still gave women two important openings. First, the 14th Amendment defined birthright citizenship. Women were thus essential to the definition of citizenship because as mothers, they gave birth to citizens of the United States if they gave birth in the United States. And since slavery had been a hereditary condition through the enslaved mother, this also meant that now black women would give birth to citizens as well. In 1857, Chief Justice Roger Taney of the Supreme Court issued the Dred Scott versus Sanford decision, and in it he wrote that black Americans had no rights that white men were bound to respect. Essentially, they were not citizens. The 14th Amendment thus affirmed the status of citizens for all black Americans, but it also did so for women and really for all Americans. So as a result, it motivated women to claim rights as citizens. And immediately after the passage of the 14th Amendment, women began a grassroots project of civil disobedience by going to the polls to vote. And they called this strategy the New Departure. The most famous example, of course, is Susan B. Anthony. In November 1872, she wrote to Elizabeth Cady Stanton that, quote, "Well, I have been and gone and done it, positively voted the Republican ticket straight this a.m. at 7 o'clock and swore my vote in at that, was registered on Friday, and 15 other women followed suit in this ward." Approximately 10 days later, a warrant was issued for her arrest for voting illegally. In her speech defending herself, called "Is It a Crime for a U.S. Citizen to Vote?", she argued that as citizens under the 14th Amendment, women had the right to vote. It is downright mockery, she argued, to talk to women of the blessings of liberty while they are denied the use of the only means of securing them provided by this democratic Republican government. And that's small d, small r, democratic Republican. While Anthony was the most famous example, hundreds of other women across the country also registered and attempted to vote under the 14th Amendment. The largest single group was 200 women in Vineland, New Jersey, and this group included 2 African-American women among them. And other African-American women participated in this effort as well. In Battle Creek, Michigan, Sojourner Truth also attempted to register and vote. Another of these women was named Virginia Minor, who was a suffragist from St. Louis, Missouri, and whose husband, Francis, was a lawyer. Unlike Susan B. Anthony's case, Minors made it all the way to the Supreme Court. And Minor versus Happersett was decided in 1875. In this decision, the Supreme Court decided that women were indeed persons and citizens, thank you, Supreme Court, but concluded that voting was not a right of citizenship. And this is a quote from the decision: "The Constitution of the United States does not confer the right of suffrage upon anyone." You'll recall the negative language of the 15th Amendment. So that ended the New Departure strategy, and while the strategy failed, the vote remained central, the central goal of the women's rights movement. And they had 2 ways of pursuing it. One was at the state level, and one was at the federal level, an amendment to the Constitution. They saw more immediate success at the state level. In 1869, Wyoming Territory granted women the right to vote. In 1870, Utah Territory granted women the right to vote. After that, 1893, the state of Colorado, 1910, the state of Washington, 1911, California, 1912, Arizona, Kansas, and Oregon, and in 1917, New York State. But the struggle for an amendment to the Constitution was a much more difficult push. So, how did women's rights activists try to get an amendment to the Constitution? They lobbied and lobbied and lobbied. They held conventions, they gave speeches, they published newspapers, they wrote books and pamphlets, they petitioned. They argued that women needed the right to vote as mothers because as mothers, women had a unique perspective to bring to the politics of the country. Anti-suffragists, of course, and there were many women who were anti-suffragists, argued that as mothers, women already had influence in the country. And on the right of this slide, you can see this was a very common theme of anti-suffrage cartoons and demonstrates this fear of gender inversion, right? Who's going to take care of the children if the women are off agitating for the right to vote or voting or participating in election days, right? Look at the poor husband having to take care of 2 babies. And so on the left-hand side is a part of the campaign for the vote in New York State. And you can see how much more progress was made in the West than in particularly the South, but also the East Coast more generally. By the early 20th century, a group of younger activists began pushing for more public and confrontational tactics modeled on the English suffragettes. So American activists are suffragists, the British are suffragettes. Many of the suffragists in a reunified National American Women's Suffrage Association believed that enfranchising women was essential to good government, clean cities, healthy and well-educated children, worker health and safety, peace, and other issues. The largest organization of women in the 19th century was the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which blamed alcohol for poverty, crime, corruption, prostitution, and other social problems. Frances Willard, the president of the organization, argued that the WCTU should do everything and that the vote would help them do so. But younger women did not necessarily share these perspectives. Many of them, like Alice Paul, founder of the National Woman's Party, were college graduates, and they wanted independence and a career, not marriage and family. It's important to note that many of the older feminists did not want marriage and family either, but they just sort of kept that separate from the campaign for the vote. And so these younger suffragists introduced new tactics. One of the most important was the suffrage parade. And they had suffrage parades in major cities across the United States. I'm just going to focus on one today, which was scheduled for the day before President Woodrow Wilson's inauguration in Washington, D.C. in 1913. Women came from all over the United States to participate in this parade, and you can see the program on the left for the parade. Suffragists, in order to recruit white Southern women to the movement, followed a policy of local custom on segregation, which was true for this parade as well. So Howard University suffragists marched in the college division of the parade, but they marched separately and together. Ida B. Wells, a suffragist and anti-lynching activist, traveled with a group of mostly white women from Illinois to the parade, and she was determined to march with her state's group. In deference to segregation, the head of the Illinois delegation told Wells Barnett that she could not march with the Illinois women. And you can see Wells Barnett's response here on the slide. The Southern women have tried to evade the race question time and again. If the Illinois women do not take a stand now in this great Democratic parade, then the colored women are lost. I shall not march at all unless I can march under the Illinois banner. I am not taking this stand because I personally wish for recognition. I am doing it for the future benefits of my whole race. In the end, she inserted herself in the Illinois delegation and marched. However, the suffrage parade ended in chaos as crowds broke the police lines, grabbed the women, pulled at their signs and clothes, and made lewd comments. The police stood by and did nothing, and so an army regiment had to intervene to allow the parade to continue. And you can see the chaos in this picture of the parade. Another new tactic was demonstrating in front of the White House. The National Women's Party, which was founded by Alice Paul, also led women in picketing in front of the White House in 1917. This was a divisive act in and outside the women's movement because it was viewed as disloyal and bad strategy to picket once the U.S. entered World War I. Mostly white women picketed the White House, but Mary Church Terrell, who's portrayed on the slide, a black suffragist and D.C. resident, and her daughter also did join the pickets. They were not arrested. It was a much bigger risk for black women to be arrested than white women, though it was not good for either, as we will see. Approximately 200 suffragists were ultimately arrested for picketing the White House, and rather than being sent to the city jail, as would have been appropriate, they were sent to Occoquan Workhouse in Virginia, where they were subject to tremendous abuse. Alice Paul eventually led them in a hunger strike, and she became the first suffragist to be force-fed, but others followed. Her colleague Lucy Burns was handcuffed with her hands over her head all night. She was stripped naked and force-fed by 5 people. This ordeal raised awareness of the women's cause and, of course, horror over their treatment. But it was an essential moment in raising awareness of the cause. This didn't mean that the National Women's Party alone achieved women's suffrage. The lobbying efforts of the National American Women's Suffrage Association were also essential to gaining the 19th Amendment. So who were the holdouts? The conservative Northeast and the South. One of the important contexts for this debate over women's right to vote was the context of Jim Crow, the violent disenfranchisement of black men during and after Reconstruction, and the strict racial segregation enforced throughout the South, as we saw in the D.C. suffrage parade. Another context was increased immigration. One of the biggest changes in American women's lives occurred outside of the law or politics, and that was declining birth rates. In 1800, the average American woman had 7 children. By 1900, this number had fallen to 3.5. The current birth rate of 1.64 has raised alarm among some politicians as well. And many politicians at the time viewed this as dangerous for the United States. There were all these immigrants coming in, but the native-born, as they would call it, Americans were not having enough children. So Teddy Roosevelt basically set out this position in 1905 in his remarks before the Mothers' Congress. The fact that there was even a Mothers' Congress indicates the importance of motherhood in the United States at the time. And you can see his argument here. If the average family in which there are children contained but 2 children, and the nation as a whole would decrease in population so rapidly that in 2 or 3 generations it would very deservedly be on the point of extinction, so that the people who had acted on this base and selfish doctrine would be giving place to others with braver and more robust ideals. Nor would such a result be in any way regrettable, for a race that practiced such doctrine, that is, a race that practiced race suicide, would thereby conclusively show that it was unfit to exist and that it had better give place to people who had not forgotten the primary laws of their being. And he goes on, the woman's task is not easy, no task worth doing is. But in doing it, and when she has done it, there shall come to her the highest and holiest joy known to all mankind, and having done it, she shall have the reward prophesied in Scripture for her husband and her children, yes, and all people who realize that her work lies at the foundation of all national happiness and greatness shall rise up and call her blessed. In other words, have more children. Of course, suffragists argued that they could be both mothers and voters, and that motherhood would make them better, more moral voters. And you can see this on the suffrage poster on this slide. Ultimately, Jim Crow posed the biggest obstacle to women's suffrage. And it was finally ratified, the 19th Amendment was finally ratified by one vote, and that was because the state politician, his mother had written him a letter and asked him to do it. As they campaigned in the South, suffragists made the argument that states could continue to regulate suffrage, and thus they assuaged Jim Crow fears of black women being able to vote. Carrie Chapman Catt, president of the National American Woman Suffrage Association, remembered, quote, as late as 1920, the average Southern Democrat was filled with explosive rage at any mention of women's suffrage. Catt viewed states' rights as a convenient argument used only by Southerners when it served their purposes, but she also reassured them that a federal amendment would not impede state laws on voting. Catt went further, arguing that women's suffrage would actually bolster white supremacy. As she pointed out, sheer numbers meant that, quote, women's suffrage in the South would so vastly increase the white vote that it would guarantee white supremacy. However, even these arguments were not enough to convince many white Southerners to vote for women's suffrage. So the 19th Amendment, what did it do and what did it not do? As you can see, the language mimics the 15th Amendment, right? The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. And of course, it continued with the usual, Congress shall have the power to enforce. It did not enfranchise women of color, particularly women of color in the southern states. Black women, Native American women, and others had to continue to fight for their right to vote. It was not until the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that all women gained the right to vote. And so one of the questions raised after the 19th Amendment was, of course, what next? The enfranchisement of women did not lead to women becoming a voting bloc, to the purification of politics, or to a more moral nation. Instead, as it turned out, women tended to vote just like the men in their family. For some suffragists, their work was done. The National American Woman Suffrage Association dissolved, and some former suffragists formed the League of Women Voters, a bipartisan organization to educate voters, which still exists today. Alice Paul's organization, the National Woman's Party, introduced the Equal Rights Amendment in 1923. It was originally known as the Lucretia Mott Amendment. The goal was to establish women's equality beyond the vote. As you can see, in the original language, men and women shall have equal rights throughout the United States in every place subject to its jurisdiction. Very positive statement. But the current language is equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of sex. So we have the same negative phrasing. Importantly, not all women and not all women's rights activists supported the ERA. Women who were involved in the Progressive Era labor movement, in particular, worried that the ERA would undermine protective legislation for women. And protective legislation for women might be laws that limited their work to 8 hours a day or banned them from working at night or similar type laws. Mary Anderson, who was chief of the Women's Bureau in the Department of Labor, noted the rationale for most of these laws. All of these kinds of regulatory laws have been obtainable for women because women's special needs were more evident to the public than were the needs of other workers. And there was a widespread appreciation of the importance of conserving the health of the actual and potential mothers of future generations. Mary Anderson referred to pro-ERA activists as theoretical feminists who did not understand the reality of factory work and the need to create better working conditions for women as well as for all workers. And so what changed? One of the things that changed was the New Deal and a strong post-World War II labor movement. As all American workers gained protections, minimum wage, maximum hours, protective labor legislation for women became less of an issue. Women in the labor movement began supporting the ERA, and the important union, the United Auto Workers, endorsed it in 1967. In 1970, before a Senate committee considering the ERA, Pauli Murray, a lawyer and founder of NOW, noted the importance of the ERA for Black women in the context of the civil rights movement, and this is her language. The Black woman has suffered more than the addition of sex discrimination to race discrimination. She has suffered the conjunction of these twin immoralities. The Black woman remains on the lowest rank of social and economic status in the United States. She argued the presence of women in more equitable proportion to their numbers in the legislatures, on the courts, and in leadership positions throughout society is the best guarantee that their rights will be protected. Women also represent a vast, untapped resource, the utilization of which may accelerate progress toward the solution of such problems as war, poverty, racism, and pollution. The adoption of the Equal Rights Amendment would be an important step toward a new era of human relations. But many women also opposed the ERA. Phyllis Schlafly founded an organization called Stop ERA. She called the ERA sick, immoral, and anti-family. She believed that the ERA would force women to abandon their traditional roles as wives and mothers. She stated, "The ERA is a fraud. It pretends to improve the status of women, but actually is a big takeaway of the rights women now possess." And you can see some of the arguments on the slide against the ERA, and this is a pro-ERA pamphlet, some of the their responses, right? The ERA will destroy the family. Men will no longer have to support their wives and children. Mothers will be forced to find jobs, leaving their children in the care of others. Woman's place is in the home. Divorced women will no longer be given support or custody of their children. The ERA will take away labor laws protecting women. Women will be subject to the draft, and mothers will be torn from their children to be sent into combat. Women will lose their present Social Security benefits based on their husband's earnings. Men and women will have to share the same public bathrooms. The ERA will legalize homosexual marriages. The ERA will mean wholesale abortion. The 14th Amendment makes the ERA unnecessary. And so these were some of the arguments that were being marshaled against the ERA. But New York Congresswomen Shirley Chisholm, and she was the woman portrayed on this slide, and Bella Abzug kept introducing the ERA, and it was finally passed by Congress in 1972. And within a year, it had been ratified by 30 states. But Congress in 1972 had also put a time limit on ratification. In 1978, Congress agreed to extend the time for ratification, but by 1982, the ERA was still 3 states short of those needed to ratify, and time had run out. Schlafly claimed victory in her defeat of the ERA, and it's probably true that her organization was largely responsible for turning the tide against the ERA. After decades, however, activists have had renewed hope for the ERA. In 2017, the state of Nevada became the 36th state to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment. The following year, the state of Illinois became the 37th, and in 2020, Virginia voted to ratify. After Virginia became the 38th state to ratify, the U.S. House of Representatives passed legislation to remove the original time limit. But at present, the U.S. Senate has not brought this to the Senate floor. There also may be other obstacles. Between 1973 and 1978, Idaho, Kentucky, Nebraska, South Dakota, and Tennessee all passed laws to rescind their prior ratifications of the ERA. However, women also benefited from other legislation and decisions in the civil rights era and beyond. Perhaps the most important was the 1964 Civil Rights Act. After Kennedy's assassination, Congress began to consider the 1964 Civil Rights Bill. Congressman Howard Smith, a Southerner, offered an amendment to add the word sex to Title VII, which already proposed to prohibit discrimination in employment on the basis of race, color, religion, or national origin. In part, Smith wanted to see the bill fail. As a Southerner, he supported segregation. But he was also a longtime supporter of rights for women, specifically the ERA. So it was basically a win-win situation for him. But supported by Lyndon Johnson, the bill passed. The Civil Rights Act created the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission to investigate complaints of race and sex discrimination. But despite this victory, the prevailing sentiment still mocked feminists. Someone at a White House conference on equal employment wondered if Playboy clubs would have to hire male bunnies. The press picked up the joke and dubbed Title VII the bunny law. A New York Times editorial read, "No more milkman, iceman, serviceman, foreman, or pressman. The Rockettes may become bisexual, and a pity too. Bunny problem indeed. This is revolution, chaos. You can't even safely advertise for a wife anymore." But we also see some other important moments as women gain the right to serve on juries. 2016, women become eligible for combat positions in the military. Of course, they are still not part of the draft. And in 2016, the first woman nominated by a major political party for the presidency. So despite the humor and mockery, the late 20th century did represent a revolution in women's status in the nation, if an incomplete one. While women now have most of the rights of citizenship, Americans remain divided over the goal of equality for women, as indicated by the impasse over the ERA. Do women have rights that would be lost, a la Phyllis Schlafly? Or is equality necessary to address the many different experiences and backgrounds of women? Do Thomas Jefferson's words now apply to women? Thank you very much.